The White Cat by W. W. Jacobs. The traveler stood looking from the taproom window of the Cauliflower at the falling rain. The village street below was empty, and everything was quiet, with the exception of the garrulous old man smoking with much enjoyment on the settle behind him. "It'll do a power o' good," said the ancient, craning his neck around the edge of the settle, and turning a bleared eye on the window. "I ain't like some folk. I never did mind a drop o' rain." The traveler grunted and, returning to the settle opposite the old man, fell to lazily stroking a cat which had strolled in attracted by the warmth of the small fire which smoldered in the grate. "He's a good mouser," said the old man, "but I expect that Smith the landlord would sell 'em to anybody for 1/4 crown. But we'd a cat in Claybury once, that you couldn't ha' bought for 100 golden sovereigns." The traveler continued to caress the cat. "A white cat with one yaller eye and one blue one," continued the old man. "It sounds queer, but it's as true as I sitter wishing that I'd another mug o' ale as good as the last you gave me." The traveler, with a start that upset the cat's nerves, finished his own mug, and then ordered both to be refilled. He stirred the fire into a blaze, and, lighting his pipe, and putting one foot onto the hob, prepared to listen. "It used to belong to old man Clark. Young Joe Clark's uncle," said the ancient, smacking his lips delicately over the ale and extending a tremulous claw to the tobacco pouch pushed towards him, and he was never tired of showing it off to people. "He used to call its blue-eyed darling, and the fuss he made that cat was sinful. Young Joe Clark couldn't bear it, but being down in his uncle's will for 5 cottages and a bit o' land bringing in about 40 pounds a year, he'd hide his feelings and pretend as he loved it. He used to take it little drops o' cream and titbits o' meat. And old Clark was so pleased that's promised him that he should 'ave the cat along with all the other property when was dead. Young Joe said he couldn't thank him enough, and the old man, who'd been ailing a long time, made him come up every day to teach him how to take care of it arter he was gone. He taught Joe how to cook its meat and then chop it up fine, how it liked a clean saucer every time for its milk, and how he wasn't to make a noise when it was asleep. "Take care your children don't worry it, Joe," he says one day, very sharp. "One o' your boys was pulling its tail this morning, and I want you to clump his 'ead for him." "Which one was it?" says Joe. "The slobbery-nosed one," says old Clark. "I'll give him a clout as soon as I get him," says Joe, who was very fond of his children. "Go and fetch him, and do it ere," says the old man. "That'll teach him to love animals." Joe went off to fetch the boy, and arter his mother'd washed his face and wiped his nose, and put a clean pinafore on him, he took him to's uncle's and clouted his 'ead for him. Arter that Joe and's wife had words all night long, and next morning old Clark, coming in from the garden, was just in time to see him kick the cat right across the kitchen. He could hardly speak for a minute, and whence could Joe see plain what a fool he'd been. First of all called Joe every name he could think of, which took him a long time, and then he ordered him out of his house. "You shall have my money when your betters have done with it," he says, "and not afore. That's all you've done for yourself." Joe Clark didn't know what he meant at the time, but when old Clark died 3 months arterwards found out. His uncle'd made a new will and left everything to old George Barstow for as long as the cat lived, providing that he took care of it. When the cat was dead, the property was to go to Joe. The cat was only 2 years old at the time, and George Barstow, who was arf crazy with joy, said it shouldn't be his fault if it didn't live another 20 years. The funny thing was the quiet way Joe Clark took it. He didn't seem to be at all cut up about it, and when Henry Walker said it was a shame, he said he didn't mind, and that George Barstow was an old man, and he was quite welcome to have the property as long as the cat lived. "It must come to me by the time I'm an old man," he says. That's all I care about." "Been and lost something?" says Henry Walker, watching him. "No, I'm finding," says George Barstow, very fierce. and picking up something. "That's the 5th bit o' powdered liver I've found in my garden this morning." Henry Walker went off whistling, and the opinion he'd o' Joe Clark began to improve. He spoke to Joe about it that arternoon, and Joe said that if he ever accused Imo such a thing again, he'd knock set off. He said that he 'oped the cat id live to be 100, and that'd no more think of giving it poisoned meat than Henry Walker would of paying for his drink, so long as he could get anybody else to do it for him. They'd bets up at this Cauliflower public house that evening as to o' long that cat'd live. Nobody gave it more than a month, and Bill Chambers sat and thought so many ways o' killing it on the sly that it was wonderful to hear him. George Barstow took fright when he heard of them, and the care took that cat was wonderful to behold. Arf its time it was shut up in the back bedroom, and the other RF George Barstow was fussing arter it till that cat got to hate him like pison. Instead giving up work as he'd thought to do, he told Henry Walker that had never worked so hard in his life. "What about fresh air and exercise for it?" says Henry. "What about Joe Clark?" says George Barstow. "I'm tied hand and foot. I dursn't leave the house for a moment. I ain't been to the Cauliflower since I've at it, and 3 times I got out of bed last night to see if it was safe." "Mark my words," says Henry Walker, "if that cat don't have exercise, you'll lose it." "I shall lose it if it does have exercise," says George Barstow, "that I know." He sat down thinking arter Henry Walker'd gone, and then he'd a little collar and chain made for it, and took it out for a walk. Pretty nearly every dog in Claybury went with him, and the cat was in such a state o' mind afore they got him he couldn't do anything with it. It had a fit as soon as they got indoors, and George Barstow, who'd read about children's fits in the almanac, gave it a warm bath. It brought it round immediate, and then it began to tear around the room and up and downstairs till George Barstow was afraid to go near it. Illustration: he'd a little collar and chain made for it, and took it out for a walk. It was so bad that evening, sneezing, that George Barstow sent for Bill Chambers, who'd got a good name for doctoring animals, and asked him to give it something. Bill said he'd got some powders at him that would cure it at once, and he went and fetched 'em and mixed one up with a bit o' butter. "That's the way to give a cat medicine," he says. "Smear it with the butter, and then it'll lick it off, powder and all." He was just going to rub it on the cat when George Barstow caught his arm and stopped him. "How do I know it ain't pissin'?" he says. "You're a friend o' Joe Clark's, and for all I know, he may have paid you to piss in it." "I wouldn't do such a thing," says Bill. "You ought to know me better than that." "All right," says George Barstow. "You eat it then, and I'll give you 2 shillings instead o' 1. You can easy mix some more." "Not me," says Bill Chambers, making a face. "Well, 3 shillings then," says George Barstow, getting more and more suspicious. "Like 4 shillings, 5 shillings." Bill Chambers shook his head, and George Barstow, more and more certain that he'd caught him trying to kill his cat, and that wouldn't eat the stuff, rose him up to 10 shillings. Bill looked at the butter, and then looked at the 10 shillings on the table, and at last he shut his eyes and gulped it down and put the money in his pocket. "You see, I have to be careful, Bill," says George Barstow, rather upset. Bill Chambers didn't answer him. He sat there as white as a sheet, and making such extraordinary faces that George was arf afraid of him. "Anything wrong, Bill?" he says at last. Bill sat staring at him, and then all of a sudden he clapped his handkerchief to his mouth, and, getting up from his chair, opened the door and rushed out. George Barstow thought at fust that he'd eaten pison for the sake o' the 10 shillings, but when he's remembered that Bill Chambers had got the most delicate stomach in Claybury, he altered's mind. The cat was better next morning, but George Barstow had such a fright about it, he wouldn't let it go out of sight. And Joe Clark began to think that would have to wait longer for that property than had thought. Arter all, to him talk anybody'd ha thought that's loved that cat. We didn't pay much attention to it up at the Cauliflower, except maybe to wink at him a thing he couldn't a bear. But Adam, o' course, his young uns thought as everything he said was gospel. And one day, coming from work, as he was passing George Barstow's, he was paid out for his deceitfulness. "I've wronged you, Joe Clark," says George Barstow, coming to the door, "and I'm sorry for it." "Oh," says Joe, staring. "Give that to your little Jimmy," says George Barstow, giving him a shilling. "I've give him one, but I thought arterwards it wasn't enough." "What for?" says Joe, staring at him again. "For bringing my cat in," says George Barstow. "How it got out, I can't think, but I lost it for 3 hours, and I'd about given it up when your little Jimmy brought it to me in's arms. He's a fine little chap, and it does you credit." Joe Clark tried to speak, but he couldn't get a word out, and Henry Walker, what had just come up and heard what passed, took hold of his arm and helped him home. He walked like a man in a dream, but halfway he stopped and cut a stick from the hedge to take to little Jimmy. He said the boy'd been asking him for a stick for some time, but up till then he'd always forgotten it. At the end o' the first year that cat was still alive, to everybody's surprise. But George Barstow took such care of, it's never let it out of sight. Every time went out, he took it with him in a hamper, and, to prevent its being pissened, he paid Isaac Sawyer, who'd the biggest family in Claybury, 6 pence a week to let one of his boys taste its milk before it had it. The second year it was ill twice, but the horse doctor that George Barstow got for it said that it was azard as nails, and with care it might live to be 20. He said that it wanted more fresh air and exercise, but when he heard George Barstow come by it, he said that perhaps it would live longer indoors arter all. At last, one day, when George Barstow'd been living on the fat o' the land for nearly 3 years, that cat got out again. George had raised the front room winder 2 or 3 inches to throw something outside, and, afore he knew what was happening, the cat was outside and going up the road about 20 miles an hour. George Barstow went arter it, but he might as well had tried to catch the wind. The cat was arf wild with joy at getting out again, and he couldn't get within arf a mile of it. He stayed out all day without food or drink, following it about until it came on dark, and then, o' course, he lost sight of it, and, hoping against hope that it would come home for its food, he went and waited for it. He sat up all night dozing in a chair in the front room with the door left open, but it was all no use, and arter thinking for a long time what was best to do. He went out and told some o' the folks it was lost, and offered a reward of 5 pounds for it. You never saw such a hunt then in all your life. Nearly every man, woman, and child in Claybury left their work or school, and went to try and earn that 5 pounds. By the arternoon, George Barstow made it 10 pounds, provided the cat was brought him safe and sound, and people as was too old to walk stood at their cottage doors to snap it up as it came by. Joe Clark was hunting for, high and low, and so was his wife and the boys. In fact, I believe that everybody in Claybury, excepting the parson and Bob Pretty, was trying to get that 10 pounds. O' course, we could understand the parson his pride wouldn't let him, but a low, poaching, thieving rascal like Bob Pretty turning up's nose at 10 pounds was more than we could make out. Even on the second day, when George Barstow made it 10 pounds down and a shilling a week for a year besides, he didn't offer to stir. All he did was to try and make fun of them as was looking for it. "Have you looked everywhere you can think of for it, Bill?" he says to Bill Chambers. "Yes, I have," says Bill. "Well, then you want to look everywhere else," says Bob Pretty. "I know where I should look if I wanted to find it." "Why don't you find it then?" says Bill. "'Cause I don't want to make mischief," says Bob Pretty. "I don't want to be unneighborly to Joe Clark by interfering at all." "Not for all that money?" says Bill. "Not for 50 pounds, says Bob Pretty. You ought to know me better than that, Bill Chambers. It's my belief that you know more about where that cat is than you ought to, says Joe Gubbins. You go on looking for it, Joe, says Bob Pretty, grinning. It's good exercise for you. And you've only lost 2 days' work. I'll give you arf a crown if you let me search your house, Bob, says Bill Chambers, looking at him very hard. I couldn't do it at the price, Bill, says Bob Pretty, shaking his head. I'm a poor man, but I'm very particular who I've come into my house. Of course, everybody left off looking at once when they heard about Bob, not that they believed that he'd be such a fool as to keep the cat in his house. And that evening, as soon as it was dark, Joe Clark went round to see him. Don't tell me as that cat's found, Joe, says Bob Pretty, as Joe opened the door. Not as I've heard of, said Joe, stepping inside. I wanted to speak to you about it. The sooner it's found, the better I shall be pleased. It does you credit, Joe Clark, says Bob Pretty. It's my belief that it's dead, says Joe, looking at him very hard, but I want to make sure afore taking over the property. Bob Pretty looked at him, and then he gave a little cough. Oh, you want it to be found dead, he says. Now, I wonder whether that cat's worth most dead or alive. Joe Clark coughed then. Dead, I should think, he says at last. George Barstow's just had bills printed offering £15 for it, says Bob Pretty. I'll give that or more when I come into the property, says Joe Clark. There's nothing like ready money, though, is there? Says Bob. I'll promise it to you in writing, Bob, says Joe, trembling. There's some things that don't look well in writing, Joe, says Bob Pretty, considering. Besides, why should you promise it to me? O' course, I meant if you found it, says Joe. Well, I'll do my best, Joe, says Bob Pretty, and none of us can do no more than that, can they? They sat talking and argufying over it for over an hour, and twice Bob Pretty got up and said he was going to see whether George Barstow wouldn't offer more. By the time they parted, they was as thick as thieves, and next morning, Bob Pretty was wearing Joe Clark's watch and chain, and Mrs. Pretty was up at Joe's house to see whether there was any of his furniture, as she'd a fancy for. She didn't seem to be able to make up her mind at fust between a chest of drawers that had belonged to Joe's mother and a grandfather clock. She walked from one to the other for about 10 minutes, and then Bob, who'd come in to help her, told her to have both. You're quite welcome, he says, ain't she, Joe? Joe Clark said yes, and arter he'd helped them carry 'em the Pretties went back and took the best bedstead to pieces, 'cause Bob said as it was easier to carry that way. Mrs. Clark had to go and sit down at the bottom of the garden with the neck of her dress undone to give herself air. But when she saw the little Pretties each walking with one of her best chairs on their heads, she got and walked up and down like a mad thing. I'm sure I don't know where we are to put it all, says Bob Pretty to Joe Gubbins. What was looking on with other folks, but Joe Clark is that generous he won't of our leaving anything. Has gorn mad? Says Bill Chambers, staring at him. Not as I knows on, says Bob Pretty. It's his good-heartedness, that's all. He feels sure that that cat's dead, and that he'll have George Barstow's cottage and furniture. I told him he'd better wait till he'd made sure, but he wouldn't. Before they'd finished, the Pretties had picked that use as clean as a bone, and Joe Clark had to go and get clean straw for his wife and children to sleep on. Not that Mrs. Clark had any sleep that night, nor Joe neither. Henry Walker was the fust to see what it really meant, and he went rushing off as fast as I could run to tell George Barstow. George couldn't believe him at fust, but whens did he swore that if a hair of that cat's head was harmed, it'd have the law o' Bob Pretty, and arter Henry Walker'd gone walked around to tell him so. You're not yourself, George Barstow, else you wouldn't try and take away my character like that, says Bob Pretty. What did Joe Clark give you all them things for? Says George, pointing to the furniture. Took a fancy to me, I suppose, says Bob. People do sometimes. There's something about me at times that makes 'em like me. He gave 'em to you to kill my cat, says George Barstow. It's plain enough for anybody to see. Bob pretty smiled. I expect it'll turn up safe and sound one of these days, he says. And then you'll come around and beg my pardon. P-raps. P-aps what? Says George Barstow, arter waiting a bit. Pap, somebody's got it and is keeping it till you've drawed the 15 pounds out of the bank, says Bob, looking at him very hard. I've taken it out of the bank, says George, starting. If that cat's alive, Bob. And you've got it. There's the 15 pounds the moment you and it over. What do you mean me got it? Says Bob pretty. You be careful o' my character. I mean, if you know where it is, says George Barstow, trembling all over. I don't say I couldn't find it, if that's what you mean, says Bob. I can generally find things when I want to. You find me that cat, alive and well, and the money's yours, Bob, says George, hardly able to speak. Now that's fancied the cat was still alive. Bob pretty shook his head. No, that won't do, he says. Suppose I did have the luck to find that poor animal. You'd say I'd had it all the time and refused to pay. I swear I wouldn't, Bob, says George Barstow, jumping up. Best thing you can do if you want me to try and find that cat, says Bob pretty, is to give me the 15 pounds now, and I'll go and look for it at once. I can't trust you, George Barstow. And I can't trust you, says George Barstow. Very good, says Bob, getting up. There's no harm done. P-aps Joe Clark'll find the cat is dead and P-aps you'll find it's alive. It's all one to me. George Barstow walked off him, but he was in such a state of mind, didn't know what to do. Bob pretty turning up his nose at 15 pounds like that made him think that Joe Clark had promised to pay him more if the cat was dead. And at last, arter worrying about it for a couple of hours, came up to this Cauliflower and offered Bob the 15 pounds. What's this for? Says Bob. For finding my cat, says George. Look here, says Bob, handing it back. I've had enough o' your insults. I don't know where your cat is. I mean, for trying to find it, Bob, says George Barstow. Oh well, I don't mind that, says Bob, taking it. I'm a hard-working man, and I've got to be paid for my time. It's only fair to my wife and children. I'll start now. He finished up his beer, and while the other chaps was telling George Barstow what a fool he was, Joe Clark slipped out arter Bob pretty, and began to call him all the names he could think of. Don't you worry, says Bob. The cat ain't found yet. Is it dead? Says Joe Clark, hardly able to speak. How should I know? Says Bob. That's what I've got to try and find out. That's what you gave me your furniture for, and what George Barstow gave me the 15 pounds for, ain't it? Now, don't you stop me now, 'cause I'm going to begin looking. He started looking there and then, and for the next 2 or 3 days, George Barstow and Joe Clark see him walking up and down with his hands in his pockets, looking over garden fences and calling puss. He asked everybody see whether they'd seen a white cat with one blue eye and one yaller one, and every time he came into the Cauliflower, he put his head over the bar and called puss. Cuss, as he said. It was as likely to be there as anywhere else. It was about a week after the cat had disappeared that George Barstow was standing at's door talking to Joe Clark, who was saying the cat must be dead and he wanted's property, when he sees a man coming up the road carrying a basket stop and speak to Bill Chambers. Just as he got near them, an awful meow come from the basket, and George Barstow and Joe Clark started, as if they'd been shot. He's found it? Shouts Bill Chambers, pointing to the man. It's been living with me over at Ling for a week pretty nearly, says the man. I tried to drive it away several times, not knowing that there was 15 pounds offered for it. George Barstow tried to take hold of the basket. "I want that 15 pounds fust," says the man. "That's only right and fair, George," says Bob Pretty, who'd just come up. "You've got all the luck, mate. We've been hunting high and low for that cat for a week." Then George Barstow tried to explain to the man and call Bob Pretty names at the same time, but it was all no good. The man said it had nothing to do with him what he'd paid to Bob Pretty, and at last they fetched Policeman White over from Cudford, and George Barstow signed a paper to pay 5 shillings a week till the reward was paid. George Barstowed the cat for 5 years arter that, but he never let it get away again. They got to like each other in time and died within a fortnight of each other, so that Joe Clark got's property arter all. Please like and subscribe for more fairy tales and similar content.